Well, the communion liturgy did a lot of the heavy lifting this morning, and Austin certainly preached in his own way early in the service. I'd like to note that Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they all offer versions of this temple scene that we heard in John's gospel this morning. But in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, in each and every one of those three gospels, the episode comes at the end, right before Jesus' death. It is in some ways the event that leads to the cross. But in John, the episode is in the second chapter, moved to immediately after Jesus' first sign, the wedding in Cana. As a result, another circumstance will serve as the impetus for Jesus' arrest in John's gospel. In John, it's not this cleansing of the temple that causes his arrest. It is the raising up of Lazarus. It is bringing someone back from the dead that will elicit the desire to get rid of Jesus. Life begets death, offering people new life, interrupting the narrative, the timetables, the way things are with the way things could be, produces animosity, friction, anger, frustration, confrontation. But that's how the story ends, not how it begins. In John, a wedding in Cana, there's a party, a celebration of joy and abundance. There are cups that are overflowing with the best stuff, which is followed by Jesus coming to Jerusalem for the Passover feast, where what's happening in of itself is not especially problematic. The exchange of coins is needed in order to purchase animals and grains, which are required for sacrificial offerings for dedicated people of faith at the temple. The objections of Jesus are not that these things are taking place at all, but seemingly the place has become an emporium. It's a cacophony of noise and smells. There's a din. Imagine, if you will, those places in the world pre-COVID that you might have been fortunate enough to have gone to. The South Rim of the Grand Canyon, or Ponte Vecchio in Florence, or the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, places where postcard pictures never show the crowds, never show the guy trying to sell you t-shirts or knockoff sunglasses, the throngs of people standing in line jostling with one another. Those old memories from pre-COVID days, remember those? Well, at the temple, there's a din, a mass of people. Surely it smells with all the animals, and there's the stench of human sweat. And Jesus, undoubtedly, like many of his contemporaries, is immensely disappointed by what he finds. It's just not the holy place he was expecting. We all might recall hoping to be moved spiritually by a place or a moment or an experience, only to be left dissatisfied by the crowds and the vendors and the sense of commercialism in a place called holy. It's not the time, in Jesus' view, for patience. It's not a time for gently tugging at the edges. It's not the time just to say a little something to somebody. It's not time to write an op-ed. It's not time to form a committee or a working group. It's just not time to be patient. We just heard Martin Luther King's response in part to the open letter of 8 white clergy in Birmingham, Alabama around Easter weekend of 1963. I'd like for a moment to share my screen to continue that letter and to share what is perhaps one of the great run-on sentences ever written. Martin Luther King wrote in his letter, "We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor, must be demanded by the oppressed. Frankly, I've never yet engaged in a direct action movement that was well-timed, according to the timetable of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation. For years now, I've heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with a piercing familiarity, This wait has almost always meant never. It's been a tranquilizing thalidomide, relieving the emotional stress for a moment, only to give birth to an ill-formed infant of frustration. We must come to see with the distinguished jurist of yesterday that justice too long delayed is justice denied. We've waited for more than 340 years for our God-given and constitutional rights. The nations of Asia and Africa are moving with jet-like speed toward the goal of political independence, and we still creep at horse and buggy pace toward the gaining of a cup of coffee at a lunch counter. I guess it's easy for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say, wait. But when you've seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you've seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, brutalize, and even kill your Black brothers and sisters with impunity, when you see the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society, when you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she cannot go to the public amusement park that has just been advertised on television, and see tears welling up in her little eyes when she's told that Funtown is closed to colored children, and see the depressing clouds of inferiority begin to form in her little mental sky, and see her begin to distort her little personality by unconsciously developing a bitterness toward white people. When you have to concoct an answer for a 5-year-old son, asking in an agonizing pathos, Daddy, why do white people treat colored people so mean? When you take a cross-country drive and find it necessary to sleep night after night in the uncomfortable corners of your automobile because no motel will accept you, when you're humiliated day in and day out by nagging signs reading white and colored, when your first name begins and your middle name becomes boy, however old you are, and your last name becomes John, and when your wife and mother are never given the respected title Mrs., when you are harried by day and haunted by night by the fact that you are a Negro, living constantly at tiptoe stance, never knowing what to expect next and plagued with inner fears and outer resentments, when you're forever fighting a degenerating sense of nobodiness, then you'll understand why we find it difficult to wait. There comes a time when the cup of endurance runs over. Men are no longer willing to be plunged into an abyss of injustice where they experience the bleakness of corroding despair. I hope, sirs, you can understand our legitimate and unavoidable impatience. Jesus was a Jew at the Jewish temple, decrying what had happened to Jewish customs in a period of Jewish oppression, decrying what had happened to Jewish practices that are at the very heart of Judaism. A Gentile could not have come to the temple that day and taken the same actions with the same authority and expected to be dealt with in the same way. Jesus' impatience occurred because he had a moral mandate to some degree or another as a Jew to offer such a mandate. We hear the words of Martin Luther King, and some of us who are white and people of conscience, we want to help. We want to advocate. We want to fight. We want to be similarly impatient to knock down the walls of racism. A number of times this year, we have named our support for the Poor People's Campaign, initially started by Martin Luther King Jr. himself in the 1960s and carried on today by people like William Barber and Liz Theo Harris, which states that racism is one of the key pillars of injustice in our country and our world. And so we advocate, and we want to do so with urgency. But those of us who are white should marry our impatience and our desires for justice with listening ears. In the New York Times and the New Yorker and the Atlantic and many other places, We might find articles stating that children in 2020 and 2021 are being harmed by staying home from school. The schools should reopen, which would benefit all children, especially children of color, Black and brown children who are disproportionately harmed by staying home from school. And well-meaning people of conscience are impatient. Get our kids back to school as soon as is possible. Do it for my kids, sure, but do it for the other kids. Open the schools for the Black kids. Do it because it's just and it's right, and I want to be an anti-racist and for children to have equity. This is a conversation that I've heard over and over, again and again over these last many months. Some parents have been extremely outspoken about this in Montclair. Perhaps that includes some of us today. That we want to get our children back to school because of the harm that is being done to Black children, which is profound, perhaps irreparable. The harm being done to all children is clearly measurable. And so we say that we demand, we urge, we call upon, or we insist that children must be back in school as soon as is possible. And I spoke to a well-meaning, highly educated white father just the other day who said he wanted children to go back to school because of the disparities in education for Black children under the current circumstances. What do we want? Kids in school, and when do we want it? We want it now. The problem is that when asked, the majority of families who aren't white, at least in Montclair, when they were asked in February, they didn't want their children to be back in school. The majority of white families did, but the majority of minority families did not. Isn't that something? It was right there in the Montclair Local a month ago. 2/3 of Black families were not in a rush to get their kids back into the public schoolhouse. It's almost as if to use King's term, white moderate, the white affluent moderate, people like me, demanded justice for children of color without ever asking the form of justice they were seeking was what the families of minority students actually wanted. Katrina and I heard a Black mom say not long ago, yet again, we are pawns. Again and again. The problem that King had with the 8 well-meaning clergy in 1963 was not their intentions, not their overarching goals, or with the sense of what was right and wrong. It's just that when you put yourself in a position to speak for others, you had better have spent a really, really long time listening first. Yes, Jesus clears the temple. Yes, King tells people that now is not the time to wait. But in both cases, most of us are being invited into the respective narratives as listeners, not speakers, as followers and not leaders. And that call to listen and to follow, well, for many of us, that is the hardest spiritual practice of them all. Peace be with you.